This is Escape Room Play, though some call me Play from the Escape Room Files, and it's time for a 10 Things series featuring Nioh 2 from the Nioh series. Yes, I can finally talk about this game in a dedicated video. And if you're wondering why the tone is different compared to the other ones, it's because it is early in the morning, but it will not stop me from going on a actual conversation about this game and just talking about other things that may or may not be related to the game footage, which is me going through the post-game, so I don't want to hear that I can't crap on this game because I didn't play it. Because I actually did play it. Despite it being part of my Steam backlog, I actually got this game for Christmas on the PS4, since it is a game series that sadly never got released on other systems. I believe it was one of those timed exclusives on the Sony systems, that is until Team Ninja. Yes, Team Ninja actually developed this game, in case you're wondering. Decided to release the game on PC, and at least of all the DLC included to make up for the bullshit console exclusive debacle people sure love to cry about. As it is a 10 Things series, I'm going to be nice and talk about the things I actually like about this game, because people think that all I do on this channel is bitch and moan about irrelevant shit, when most of it is either me putting in my own 2 cents about copying and pasting the same arguments that everyone their fucking mother on Reddit has, or that it's just other videos like this where it isn't necessarily ranting, but just more or less, well, talking about things I feel that are important, or just other funny shit, or even gameplay clips, because why not? I want to make a couple disclaimers before we actually begin. First of all, I have not played the original Nioh, despite that being part of my backlog as well. And quite honestly, after playing Nioh 2, I have certainly no clue if I even want to touch the original Nioh, which I'll probably talk about when we get to the other side of the hater coin, as they call it. And number 2, I'm going to be doing a lot of comparisons to Dark Souls, despite people saying you can't play this like a Dark Souls game. And finally, number 3, if people want to doubt my skills in the Dark Souls games, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Now, let's get into the juicy bits. One of the interesting things about Nioh 2 is that there are a number of versatile playstyles that you can use in the game, despite the seemingly limited number of weapons that are actually in the game, or at least weapon types. But they each come with their own set effects, and of course the stances which you can use throughout the game. Now, despite me using high stance because it is the one that does the most damage, i.e. letting you beat the game quicker, that doesn't mean that there aren't any invalid options, as long as, well, you're not dying, and, well, crying when you do die. Unlike something like Dark Souls, where you only have whatever movesets the game wants to give to you, you can actually mix up on the fly. Each stance for each weapon comes with its own benefits and disadvantages. So when you fight someone using a weapon, you have to pay attention to what stance they're using, as this will indicate on what abilities they'll be able to use, which does mix up the flow of the gameplay a bit. And I can definitely appreciate Team Ninja at least allowing people to find a playstyle that works for them, whether it be able to parry with certain swords, or be able to buff your attack power with specific weapons. Even if they're not using that proper stance, there are things in Nioh 2 that I do wish other games would take into consideration, and I feel that Nioh 2, and knowing that Nioh 1 also does this as well, though probably 2 does it a little bit better, I wouldn't know. Just the fact that you're able to quickly on the fly change weapon stances is definitely appreciated. Not that I didn't use it very much, because honestly a lot of it kind of felt pointless, but from an objective viewpoint, Nioh 2 does allow you to approach most combat options, and you have the tools to do exactly that. This is something that Dark Souls fans will foam at the mouth for, and that they'll cry if you so much as mention that Dark Souls doesn't have a story. Well, believe it or not, Nioh 2 actually does have a story. Albeit it is a prequel to Nioh 1, which is always exciting. But there's actually reasons of what you're doing, and there's actual cutscenes that explain what you're doing. And unlike a lot of modern day AAA slop, there's time for action and there's time for cutscenes. And in between the combat, There's little text menus that explains the context of what you're doing in said mission. Yes, Nioh 2 is set in missions. We'll get to that later. There's actually a reason as to what you're doing, and it's not just because you have amnesia, you are the only one who can stop this dreaded war or whatever. There's actually a reason of what you're doing, and it is conveyed rather well. And it doesn't require you to look up bullshit lore from the 17th century of Japan and shit, or whatever setting this game takes place in. Yeah, I can certainly admit I didn't pay much attention to the story, since a lot of these Souls-likes tend to be very vague with it and shit, but a person playing this game casually that doesn't skip the cutscenes, they can at least kind of put two and two together as to what's going on without having to watch a certain YouTuber or having to look up 3 goddamn wikis just to understand the basics of, well, storytelling. I'm not going to say that Nioh 2 doesn't have a story, because it does. Granted, I also use this setting in the options menu that allows you to skip cutscenes after viewing them the first time because, like I said, I personally didn't care, but to say that Nioh 2 doesn't have a story is factually false. It is there, and it is presented in the way games should be, but it's a nice middle ground for when games shove cutscenes down your face, but there is a clear start and end goal. Speaking of, there's actually menus that explain shit, mostly. It is still very much appreciative, unlike the Dark Souls games or anything that From Software has made that isn't Armored Core, Kingsfield, or The Adventures of Cookie and Cream. The thing is that Nioh actually has an explanations button that actually pretty much explains what each ability does, within the game's context of language, of course. So when you find an item and you're not sure what it does, you can pull up the inventory menu, push one button, highlight over it, and it'll tell you exactly what it does in the context of how the game works. It's kind of sad that Dark Souls fans will defend this because they rather figure things out like it's some shitty Helix Cube or some shit. Helix Cube? I don't even fucking know. The Dark Souls fans who defend that the game doesn't explain everything and doesn't necessarily hold your hand, that's not exactly healthy design when it's perfectly fine for something to have an optional help button and not just some shitty prompt like it's Doom Eternal literally telling you how to fight the enemies. Which is kind of funny because the game doesn't even do that, and yet people will praise something like Doom Eternal for just getting to the point because
clowns were sitting around playing video games.
Nioh 2 actually explains shit, and it doesn't have to patronize you while doing it. And it's there in case you need a quick reference. I didn't have to look up a wiki just to figure out what something did unless I was extremely confused, and thankfully there weren't many occasions where I was extremely confused. So, despite the game being a Souls-like, which I'll definitely talk about later, Nioh 2 actually does the thing that most Souls-likes would dream of, actually having explanations. And Team Ninja, I actually applaud you for doing exactly that.
Golf clap? Golf clap.
Speaking of what Souls fans would foam at the mouth for, the game actually has a practice mode. Okay, kind of. When you're not doing missions, or if you just want to freshen up before actually going to battle, there's a dojo mode which allows you to fight basic enemies as well as getting used to the game's standard controls. There's also a tutorial mode, though a lot of the missions that you will partake in later on will allow you to unlock special missions, which when completed in aforementioned dojo mode, you actually will unlock extra abilities. So the training mode isn't necessarily there just to freshen up your skills, but a special set of missions that may be daunting, but it is definitely worth doing, especially if the weapon you're using is definitely suited to your playstyle. Though probably because of some of the boss layouts, it is actually quite easy to literally exploit the pathfindings of the AI. Or as the kids call it these days,
Jeez, jeez, jeez. Jeez, jeez, jeez. Jeez, jeez, jeez. Yay!
there actually is a practice mode, and I actually can appreciate that. It sucks you can't summon every single type of enemy in the game, but you can summon basic enemies. And just the fact that you have something that does let you practice against the standard enemies compared to what Souls games wish they could have, or even a more functional version of the Danger Room from the X-Men in Doom Eternal, if you know, you know. This is definitely something that more games should have. It's also kind of said that something like Bayonetta 1, specifically Bayonetta 1, despite having a practice mode, is locked in loading screens, and because the PC is so magnificently made, it loads too fast to be able to practice in the practice mode. You whimsical bastards. I know it's a bit of an oddball mayonnaise tier comparison, but I don't give a fuck. The fact that Nioh 2 actually has a dojo mode where you can practice your basic skills if you're not sure what to do is a definitely nice set of refreshing change of pace. I probably worded that wrong, but I don't fucking care. Another idea that Souls players foam at the mouth for is the ability to respec. It was technically introduced in Dark Souls 2, but it was made kind of more easier, quote unquote, in Dark Souls 3, but at a cost. Dark Souls adapts to the choices you make. The game is tailored by how you allocate your attribute points. How respecing in Nioh 2 works is that you have to find an item known as the Book of Reincarnation, and even though it costs a lot of gold, accumulating a lot of gold in a later game is rather easy, and if you use this in between missions, you can basically get a refund on all your Amriata to basically, well, respec. It works in a similar manner, and unlike something like Dark Souls 3, you don't have to find a special Covenant item to do it, you don't have to wait for 5 playthroughs to do it, and despite the fact that Dark Souls 3 also lets you change your game appearance at the cost of said item, which also costs as a rebirth, you don't have to also use said item in Nioh 2. You can change up your character's appearance at any time. Unless it's some special setting which I didn't catch, but it's the type of trimming out the bullshit that doesn't necessarily take away from the game experience, but if this were to be brought in something like Dark Souls, Jesus Christ, prepare for a 10-hour essay on how video games were ruined until Dark Souls came into the picture. Speaking of customization, when the original Nioh came out, I can imagine some people being mad at the fact that you can only play as a male character, and the fact that I actually knew people who wouldn't want to play certain video games just because they were a male character is kind of sad. It's like, okay, this game is great, but if I can't play as a female, the game sucks. That is some absolute entitlement, but I'll digress. Thankfully, Nioh 2 fixes exactly that, because at the start of the game, you can choose to play as a man or a woman, and nothing in between. Okay, I'm kidding, but at least there's no Type A and Type B bullshit. It's clear, cutthroat on what character you want to play as, and if you want a sex change in between your wonderful yokai slaying adventures, you can do exactly that. Not much else to talk about. Though I didn't really spend a lot of time customizing my character, though I did make him look blackface, so you can have fun writing comments on what a piece of shit I am, because God forbid I use something that's controversial in a video game that's all about slaying yokai in 1500 Japan or some gay shit. Despite the nature of this game, which, you guessed it, I'm going to have to talk about later on, there's actually a lot of replay value for a game that has a bunch of missions and shit. Unlike other Souls-likes, where once you beat the game, you're booted into New Game Plus, you can technically replay missions and acquire more levels, you can fight certain bosses again, you can fight certain enemies again, and because of how the game is structured, you can technically get a lot more replay value. Now, I'm not going to lie, once I got past the parts of the game where I thought I would have to quit, mainly a certain boss and some other areas, there's something about the game that made me want to keep going back. I would dream to have this type of replay value in a game like Dark Souls, but because of how the game is structured, it doesn't work that way. But for the action, Western, Japanese, role-playing game, whatever, you actually do get a lot of replay value, even for the release point of this game. It doesn't open the life and times of Jennifer Lee, the life and times of the C-19 virus going on at the time, made a lot of people quite isolated, so having a game like this was a hell of a lot more replayable than that of Doom Eternal. And in before mayonnaise comparisons here once again, mind you that both these games come out the same year. I kind of wish I put my ignorance aside for Nioh 2, but it was also a PS4 exclusive at the time, and then once I finally bought the game on PC, I couldn't play it because the size was big. And then the same thing happened when I got this game for Christmas, just like with Doom 2016. Kind of had to buckle down and actually play it, lest I be told that I wasted money on a game like Street Fighter V. And that game, I'm sorry, still sucks. And so does the sequel. But that's for another day. Yes, there is actually a gallery mode. Now, unfortunately, you can't take control of the characters and actually perform moves or just beat up on other characters, but unlike something like Dark Souls, there's actually a whole ass gallery mode which allows you to view character models in a dedicated arena and stuff, getting even more context to the characters and other interesting little history pieces regarding the yokai, which are apparently based on real Japanese mythos and shit. And even getting some sweet camera views of specific boss fights, and some of which are quite sadomasochists in the cat language. If you know, you know. But seriously, it is a nice change of pace of being able to look at the various character models while getting some brief history. Now, if only From Software would learn this, we actually get actual good games for once, and not games made just to piss off the player. Now, I can't technically put this as a positive because I haven't tested it, and I don't know if I ever will, but the cooperative experience in Nioh 2, I hear, is a hell of a lot more interesting than that of Dark Souls, whereas in all the Souls games, you're only limited to co-op in specific areas, and something like the Valley of Drakes, you can't necessarily summon because it's no boss, and something like Dark Souls 2, you can't exactly summon in the Dark Chasm of Old because, well, the game fucking hates you. You can technically go through Nioh 2 from start to finish, as the game is structured a la missions, but unlike something like Dark Souls, where you can use an item that doesn't cost anything, Nioh 2 does require to use something known as something cups, and offering them at the shrine. But since there are plenty of ways to restock on said things, it isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sounds annoying as Bloodborne, but having to pay a currency to summon is still kind of shitty. But I won't judge, and even though there are NPC summons that you can use for certain areas, well, let's just say that I seldomly used them because they were kind of out of the way. Not to dip into negativity yet, but there were very few areas actually to summon because, well, some of the boss fights were ridiculously bullshit. But they were also not out of the way, so I didn't mind using them. But, oh well. And finally, for those who aren't exactly the biggest fans of English dubs or subs, the game has both English and Japanese voiceovers and text options. So for those who are saying that anime is ruined, Nioh 2 has you covered. I can't say anything more than that, because, well, we all know Japan is certainly quite wholesome in making Japanese animations, am I right? There are things in Nioh 2 that I do like. There's probably other things that I could have mentioned, but as it is a 10 things series video, I don't want to come off as a rambling asshole. What I'm going to come off as in the next video, though, is just me being an asshole, but twice the rambling and twice the assholelessness, because I gotta go into the 10 things I hate about Nioh 2. Watch in part 2, and I'll see you all next file. Thanks for watching, and take care.